thank you guys very much for coming. My name is Jed Greenberg. I'm a programming director at the University of Chicago Federalist Society. And today it's my pleasure to introduce to you Judge James C. Ho of the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. So Judge Ho sits in Dallas, but his journey to the law began here in Chicago, where he attended the University of Chicago Law School. After graduating from Stanford University with honors, he graduated from here with high honors, serving as an editor of the Law Review and a member of the Order of the Coit. Judge Ho subsequently served in all three branches of government as the chief counsel for the subcommittee on the Constitution and Immigration and the Office of Legal Counsel, and as a special assistant United States Attorney General in civil rights. Judge Ho then came down to Texas, where he both worked in the Dallas office of Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher and served as the Solicitor General. He was then the co-chair of Gibson Dunn's Appellate and Constitutional Law Practice Group. Judge Ho, among many other distinctions, he is the co-chair of the Asian Pacific American Bar Association and a member of the delegation to the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination and Continuity of Government. Please join me in welcoming Judge Ho. Also sorry for Judge Smith and Justice Thomas. I forgot that.
Start. Well, thank you all for inviting me to be back here. First of all, let me start by saying I hope that you all don't mind. We're calling a bit of an audible today. My voice is not what it should be, and so instead of giving a long, boring speech, we thought it might be more interesting for you all anyway to just have a Q&A, if that's all right. I'm happy to sort of talk about whatever you all are interested in. I will just start by saying I'm always excited to be back at the law school. I guess I don't know if I want to publicly admit how long ago I graduated from here, but let's just say that despite the many, many years since I last lived here in Chicago, my 3 years here continue to be the most fond memories of my lifetime. And so in that sense, I'm really rather jealous of you all, because it's exciting to be at this place, exciting to think about what careers you might have in store for yourselves. My class of 1999, I'll admit, I think boasts, among other people, heads of major public interest groups in DC, former general counsel to a vice president of the United States, 3, I think soon to be 4 members of the United States Courts of Appeals. I say almost 4 because Anthony Johnstone of Montana has been nominated by President Biden to be on the Ninth Circuit. I'm not sure where that is, but I think he's going to be confirmed fairly soon, or at least I assume so. I mentioned all of this, and then I could go on and on. I won't bore you with all the resume lines from my class, but it's just sort of fun to think. I'd like to think for you all that you sit around and think about your class. You are sitting with the future leaders of our legal profession in any number of different respects. And to me, that was an exciting part of going to this law school. Perhaps the most important part of my going to law school is this is where I met my wife, which I think is an appropriate, it makes it appropriate for me to be here on Valentine's Day, because this is where I met my Valentine. You might say, well, that makes it actually very inappropriate, because where is she? You're not with your wife on Valentine's Day. Well, this is actually the first year, I believe, that we're going to be apart. She is in Pasadena today, helping one of her associates get ready for his first oral argument before the Ninth Circuit. And so once she was booked, I decided, okay, if you guys are free Valentine's Day, I have to be solo anyway, so I might as well be back here where I first met her. Like I said, I'm just honored to always come back here whenever invited, and excited for you all.
Would you like to lead us off?
Sure, thank you, Jed, and thank you, Judge Ho. We're always thrilled to have you back. I've been joking with Jed that the theme of today's talk should be Originalism is our Valentine. So, as the Federalist Society, we're very glad to have you here to talk about our shared love for originalism and the Framers' Republic. So, Jed and I thought that we could maybe bounce back and forth on a few questions, and then we would open it up to the audience for any questions that they might have. And maybe to start with, would you mind sharing a little bit about your background? Jen listed off some of the really interesting things that you've done in your career, including a lot of public service. Maybe you could share what your journey's been like and how much of what you've done that you expected to do or different roads that you took.
Sure. Well, let's see, where to begin. So I guess I'll start by talking about clerking, because that was the first thing I did out of law school. There's, I guess, an increasing trend these days of people clerking later, not right out of law school, but sort of further along in their careers. But I clerked right out of law school, as many still do now. And for me, as a law student who was not the child of lawyers or anything like that, I didn't really know anything about clerkships until I got here. And at first I thought, well, what a neat experience, neat opportunity that was described to me. I went to law school to do public service. I graduated, majored in public policy in college, spent a year between college and law school working in the California State Senate, and so public service was sort of why I was doing this. And so naturally, when I heard about judicial clerkships, I thought immediately, that's awesome, I want to pursue that. But I also thought it seemed sort of backwards, because of all the things that you should be doing right after you graduate from law school, when you really don't know anything, you've never practiced law, you think that helping a judge decide cases should be sort of later in life, not the first thing you do out of law school, but something that you do after you've gained more seniority. Now that I've obviously experienced the clerkships on both ends, I think it is absolutely the ideal way to start a legal career, either right out of law school or sometime after. And that's because if you go to a law firm or most legal contexts, you're going to have the opportunity to work on some handful of cases. And you'll play a small role in helping to prepare some sort of final work product, whether it's brief or a motion or getting ready for an oral argument. And you'll do this half a dozen times, something like that, during that first year. Clerking, by contrast, you're going to see literally hundreds of final products. Final product after final product after final product. And you're going to see from the recipient, from the audience's standpoint, obviously the target is audience of any brief or argument is the judge. You're going to see what works to persuade your audience, or perhaps more to the point, what doesn't work. And you're going to have all of these reps from which I think if you're devoted to your clerkship year, you can start to sort of figure out, okay, what are the patterns that you see in persuasive advocacy, persuasive writing? What makes a good oral argument? What's a critical error that you see constantly lawyers making? And then you can sort of begin, after you see this pattern, sort of reverse engineer, and it becomes almost instinctive to yourself what works. To this day, I think people who have clerked, you sort of advance your careers a few extra years compared to your compatriots in law firms and in litigation who have never clerked. Because at this point, they're still guessing what they think works with judges. Right? If you make an argument that is terrible, but you win the case, you might draw the wrong lesson from what worked, and vice versa. You may make one of the best arguments ever. And yet, look, as I always say, I don't care how good a lawyer you are, you're not convincing Justice Ginsburg to overturn Roe v. Wade. You're not convincing, to overturn, and you're not convincing Justice Thomas to affirm it. It's just, there are limits to advocacy. And so just because you win a case doesn't mean you had great advocacy. Just because you lose doesn't mean you didn't. That's what you get from being behind the curtain, if you will. Clerking for a year or two is getting those reps so that you can then be the one developing those final products. So I'll just make that pitch for clerking being a great way to start a little career. I don't know if I answered the question, but that begins a conversation at least.
That's a great place to start. Thank you.
I'm assuming Chicago still has a great, at least when I was here, I thought the law school was fantastic at helping students, sort of teaching them how it works, how do you apply, why is a clerkship valuable? Not everybody does it, not everybody should, but for a lot of students, depending on what your legal interests and career interests are, it can be a fantastic way to start. And I always felt very fortunate coming here and having great mentoring from not just professors, but actually, is upperclassmen the right term? There were 2 L's and 3 L's. In fact, when I interviewed for my clerkship with Judge Smith, it was a 3L. Somebody I'd gotten to know when I was a 1L and he was a 3L. He was then in the chambers and was one of my first interviews, so that helped calm me down as well, since I was already friends with him.
Thank you, Judge. So you started your career, as you mentioned, clerking in Houston, but then you went to Washington, D.C. for a while before returning to Texas. Can you discuss kind of the geographic considerations that people should have when choosing a market to start their career and to move to?
So I have a bit of an unusual track record in that I grew up in California, and in another lifetime I would have gone back to California. But wanted to spend at least a few years in DC. Never wanted to stay in DC for a long time, but planned on being in DC for a few years. Just kind of, I was interested in public service, so naturally DC is a fantastic place to go. It was not a place I wanted to settle and raise a family, with no disrespect intended for those who decide to do that there. I just didn't want to do that for myself. Eventually sort of just lost contact with my LA roots. And thank goodness I met my Valentine, who was a native Texan, and she wanted to go back to Texas, so that's how we ended up. For those who want to be in their home state, but are open to another experience in a different place, I thought it was great for me because DC obviously is an important place for lawyers, and being able to sort of learn how that place works, work in the different branches of government there, get a sense of that dynamic, and then sort of bring home those experiences and those networks, I think really did help me have a different perspective on the world than sort of your typical Texas litigator.
Yeah, that's a great experience. Thank you. Now you've been in Texas. You've been on the bench for 5 years now. And so happy recent 5-year anniversary. And wow, in your time on the bench, not only have you been hearing cases, you've also been writing and speaking about a number of topics, including originalism. So maybe could you share with us a little bit about this concept of fair weather originalism and the struggle to be a true originalist?
Sure. I guess maybe I'll give a quick synopsis of the remarks that I would have given otherwise. So on the one hand, originalism has sort of enjoyed somewhat of a triumph, right? A lot of people now say, across the ideological spectrum, a lot of people are claiming the mantle of originalism. Justices Scalia and Thomas certainly were, Scalia was, and Justice Thomas today is, card-carrying local originalists. Justice Kagan, of course, described herself during the Senate confirmation process as saying that we're all originalists at this point. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson was very robust. She sort of went on and on. I forget, I have the quotes in my speech, obviously, but on and on about how the text and the original understanding of how the text was drafted, that's what binds her as a judge. And so originalism has gained this sort of intellectual consensus in a way. On the other hand, what you're not seeing is, I think a lot of people would agree, you're not seeing necessarily consistent originalism. And so the core of my speech, I can go into more detail, but the core of my speech is essentially there's sort of two key ways in which you'll see divergence from originalism. One is when judges are essentially feel pressure from the outside. You have certain issues that a lot of your sort of leading institutions of elite thought believe that the direction of the law should be in one direction. Judges, being humans, have this whole talk about judges as referees. Maybe I'll give this vignette real quick. Chief Justice Roberts famously described judges as refs, as umpires. And I think that's actually a very good metaphor, but also kind of a interesting predictive metaphor, because for those of you who are fans of sports, are you familiar with home field advantage? I ask because it turns out that home field advantage is not just a myth that sports fans know about or suspect is happening or are angry about. Home field advantage has actually been statistically proven. There's a whole book called Scorecasting that talks about a number of different sports phenomenon, devotes an entire chapter to the topic of home field advantage. And what the chapter focuses on is that it's true, it's actually statistically provable. It's because of the refs. and it's because of the refs responding to the sound of the hometown audience. And what they've shown through various studies is that refs don't like to be booed. Right? Just like, refs are human beings, right? Nobody likes to be booed. And so they did a number of studies. The one I always think of is this soccer study. They had a whole group of soccer refs watch a soccer game on TV. They broke it up into two camps. One room saw it with the audio turned regular. Another room saw it with the audio turned off. And the room with the audio turned off, those refs called the same number of penalties against the home and the away team, in contrast to the other room where there was more penalties called against the away team. In fact, in the post-COVID environment, we actually now have real-time analysis of this, because you have experience now in Europe holding a series of soccer games with no hometown audience whatsoever. And whereas you used to have statistical bias towards home field advantage, with no hometown audience in these major important soccer games, the bias was eliminated. My point is essentially, if Chief Justice Roberts is right, that judges aren't like refs, and I think he is right, well, you would see a natural bias here as well. Judges feel the pressure to vote the way the hometown wants them to vote. So I think that's one aspect of fair weather originalism. Another aspect that I don't talk as much about in the speech, but I've addressed later, is you can potentially bias your views because you're afraid of being booed, but you can also potentially bias your views because you in fact yourself rooting for a particular set of parties. There's a saying in my chambers, you all will hear this soon, which is text, not try. I try very hard to resist the notion that any judge, any member of my court is supposed to be rooting for a particular tribe, whether it's Democrats or Republicans, businesses or employees, government or citizen. We're all humans, and we all have our personal passions. But if you want to be a judge, if you want to be a law clerk, if you want to be part of this neutral legal system, the overarching goal should be to try to always combat your priors and to take you where the law will take you. There are going to be competing philosophies, right? Text versus intent, precedent versus originalism, et cetera, et cetera. But the goal, hopefully, no matter where you sort of come down on these various methodological disputes, is a neutral set of principles that you're going to apply to every case. And again, hopefully it's text, not tried. That's sort of a summary of my fair weather originalism speech.
Fantastic. So, Judge, how did you become an originalist? Did you know coming into law school that this was how law should be viewed? Did Richard Epstein teach it to you? Or, what drew you to that jurisprudence?
So, it's funny because, most people go into college who are interested in public policy. They're interested because they have a certain set of viewpoints or a certain issue that they really care about. That actually wasn't me. I wasn't driven because I cared about X or Y or Z. I was just kind of fascinated by the process. Perhaps this is somewhat of my sort of immigrant background, although I don't want to go back. I just find America endlessly fascinating. How we are this amazingly diverse nation, right? 300 million people. Our tradition is one of great passion and emotion. We disagree. We don't just disagree. We disagree passionately, vigorously, sometimes angrily. And yet somehow we are able, hopefully we will continue to be able to come together. I'm fascinated by the original debates of our country. The Federalists, you may recall, the Articles of Confederation didn't go very well, so we have this debate about what do we do to replace the Articles. The Federalists believe strongly in the importance of unifying the former colonies into one single country under a constitution. They felt that the benefits from scale would be enormous, from economic advantage to foreign policy to military to diplomacy, on and on and on. You guys are Chicago students, you know about economic arguments, right? The benefits from scale, right? That's what the Federalists propounded. And that's why we need to put these states together under one common banner, one national federal government. The anti-Federalists thought this was stupid, this was crazy, right? They angrily said, you're never going to work, this is too big of a country, we're too diverse. We're going to end up just disagreeing with each other and we will never get anything done. We're much better off separate, apart. Obviously the Federalists won. And I think they won because we have come up with a system where people are able to channel their political energies, their disagreements, to a system that we all understand will resolve our differences. We'll have, under a federalism system, state governments, so that you don't have to agree with everybody, you can just live in your community. But we will all work together on those issues for which 300 million Americans will be better off under one national banner rather than in a bunch of smaller city-states. I just found that fascinating. And then to get to your point about originalism, so that's what drove me, is not a particular issue, but just a love of the system, of the process. To me, I know that originalism has all of this sort of heavy political baggage and connotation. I think of originalism really as just being a good lawyer. Right, so let's put aside the Constitution for a moment, because that just carries so much emotion. Let's just talk about contracts. If you have two parties enter into a contract, I think what you'll end up doing is when you negotiate over, it's hard enough in a democracy or between contracting parties to come to agreement. But once you come to agreement, you obviously need to have a common understanding of how this text that you've reduced your agreement to, how it's going to be interpreted in the event of a dispute. And I think if you sort of hide behind the veil of ignorance, I think where the natural convergence will be is that you'll settle on an interpretive system that will construe the document neutrally, certainly not randomly and not in a biased manner. Nobody's going to want the document biased against them. And so the only sort of natural equipoise position will be is we'll settle on a neutral approach. So to me, I get that saying you're originalist can be controversial in some ways, but to me, judges swear an oath to follow the Constitution. That's really all that originalism is. It's really just part of the job description. It's promising to be faithful to the document. Are we going to have debates about what that means and whether undecision is faithful or faithless? Of course we're going to have that. But I would like to think that the overall project should be one of consensus. And in that respect, I'm glad to see that, at least at the Supreme Court level, the justices are at least talking about the same game.
And I guess picking up on the theme of consensus and disagreement, you describe the debates over the Constitution as rooted in kind of like good faith disagreement, and that being at the root of a lot of the economy of scale that the founders foresaw. I mean, disagreement and consensus and how to disagree has been all over the news, especially when it comes to law schools. And you've been in the middle of quite a bit of that. So can you talk a little bit about free speech on campus, what you see as threats or some promising signs?
Sure, no, absolutely. So we talked about 300 million Americans disagreeing and all that. But if there's any place where we should be learning how to disagree, how to agree to disagree, it should be our nation's higher learning, and especially on the law schools. I gave a talk shortly after Ilya Shapiro got into his controversy. I just randomly happened to be invited to Chicago, happened to be scheduled to be at Georgetown, so I decided to give a talk about the topic. And what I said is this: for those who hate what Ilya said, for those who, and he said that he described his position inartfully, and I'll sort of take him out as we're on that, but in terms of the underlying position that he's expressing, for people who vociferously disagree with that viewpoint, I would submit that as a law student, the last thing you should want is for him to not be there anymore. Because you don't get anything out of just talking to yourself, out of talking to people who agree with you. You will not be improved as a law student. You will not strengthen your skills as a lawyer unless you're constantly dealing with and dueling with people who see the world completely the opposite. I think Nadine Strossen has this movement she's coined, "Make John Stuart Mill Great Again." And I'm a big fan of this because I remember loving what I read of John Stuart Mill back in college. And yeah, exactly right. Like the benefits of robust debates, this notion of if you can't find somebody to agree with you, to disagree with you, then you basically are forced to come up with the arguments yourself to make sure that you're right. But that you're much better off actually finding a human being who does disagree with you because they'll be the best at taking you on. If you have that environment, then one of two things is going to happen. They might convince you that you're wrong, in which case I think you're better off if you say, oh wow, as it turns out I was completely off base. And even if you're stubborn and you think, you know what, there's no way I'm going to change my mind, I'm definitely right, at a minimum, you'll get better at advocating your case. One of the things that I used to do in both in private practice and in the SG's office, when you get ready for an argument, you're constantly, of course, you're moving your case. You want every possible challenging question asked of you because you want to be ready for it before your actual argument. But one of the moves I make towards the end of the process is always telling all my colleagues, right now we have the chance, hypothetically, to totally change sides. We can take the other opposite position. Sort of, remember the TV show Let's Make a Deal? Right? You can take what's behind door number two. Obviously, this is not real. You're not allowed to do that. That would be highly unethical. But I think it's actually a useful academic exercise to pretend you get to be the other side. Are you happier? Because if you are happier, then you have more work to do, right? Because that means you need to figure out, okay, why is it that I'm nervous about my position? One of the things that I love to do is, if there's some question, for those of you doing moot courts, either in Bigelow or in moot court, there may be some question that you are really afraid is going to be asked. If you find that question, what you should do is obsess about it to the point where you turn yourself around and say, you know what? I now hope somebody asks that question. Because I now finally, after working hard and obsessing about it for hours and hours, I figured out an answer that I'm excited to give because I think it's really creative. I think it's really important. You can't always achieve that, particularly when you have cases that are thrust upon you. It may just be a hard case. But that's always the ideal, is take the question that you're most paralyzed with fear about and turn it into something that you're excited to do. And to wrap up, that's you don't get that when you go to a school or when you live in an environment where everybody agrees with you. For that matter, that's why we have multi-member appellate panels. Right? To my view, it would be a complete waste of taxpayer money if we always agreed with one another. Right? Why do we need 9 justices or 3 judge panels or some team member on box if you're supposed to agree? The whole point is that you're going to disagree. But ideally, you have a spirit not of unanimity, but of collegiality, where you genuinely work with each other. Some of my favorite colleagues on my court are people, I think some people would not expect to be my favorite people. But it's because, not that we always agree with each other, but because we have a mutual respect and we can learn from each other. Maybe there's a middle position that we can all agree on to provide sort of a uniform understanding of the law. But if nothing else, we at least have the intellectual respect that we can provide the public with a good faith debate.
Thank you, Judge. And you spoke extensively about your time as an advocate. You won thrice at the Supreme Court, argued more than 50 times in front of courts of appeals, and now you sit on the court and you see a lot of appellate advocates. What can people who are budding appellate advocates do better, and what distinguishes really good lawyering to you from the rest?
There are entire CLEs devoted to that topic. One of the things I tell clerks at the beginning of the year, particularly those who already know that they want to become litigators and appellate advocates, is this is going to be a confidence-boosting experience for you. Because at least at the Federal Court of Appeals level, you'll be surprised by the median level of advocacy. And inevitably, at the end of the year, the clerks say, oh yes, that's absolutely right. I tell them, yeah, by the end of the year, it's not that you don't have a lot more improving to do, believe me, you guys have a lot more improving to do. But you will already be ahead of the pack when it comes to advocacy. I'll just give a couple of thoughts, because obviously there are entire classes obviously devoted to this. I think what's true not just of oral advocacy before a federal court of appeals, but really just whatever you do in life, know your audience, right? And that obviously has multiple levels, but figure out. I'll just pick a few topics. One of the things that I've always known in theory, but really never appreciated, not even being a clerk, I really took being a judge to fully appreciate this as an actual matter, is courts of appeals judges, particularly on busy courts like the Fifth Circuit, I think you'd be surprised how many cases we have to process at any given moment. So I'll contrast being an advocate. As an oral advocate, for those of you in the court, you all, I think, understand this, the days and weeks leading up to an oral argument, you're obsessed with your case, right? You're not just rereading your briefs, rereading the other side's briefs, looking at their footnotes, studying the record, reading key opinions over and over again, obsessing about every possible question you can be asked, and sharpening your best 20-word answer into your best 7-word answer. All you're doing is thinking about that one case. Well, the Fifth Circuit, we're getting ready for as many as 20 oral arguments at a time. So we can't come anywhere near close to having the level of mastery of your case. Because even if I were willing to not sleep and not see my family, I still divide my time over 10 to 20 cases. And so I actually wish we argued fewer cases, not because I don't like argument, but precisely because I love arguments. I want to be more prepared as a judge than I feel I can, given the workload. But knowing that as an oral advocate, that at the end of the day, you know more about your case than the judge does. So in a way, you're a teacher. That's the way I would approach it. But the ideal is actually you're a law clerk, right? Because you sound like you're just neutrally presenting a case. Now, at the end of the day, obviously we know, as judges, you're advocates. You're not just neutrally presenting a case, you're trying to tilt it on side. But the more you can sound like you're just a fellow intellectual helping us to grapple with the case, teaching us where we're missing information, and then sort of showing, okay, I'm advocating here, but this is why the advocacy is right. I think that's a good balance to strike. And the second is just knowing our job is not just to decide your case. You want to win your case for your client. We're trying to figure out what should the law be given the authorities available. What is the rule that should be applicable to other parties? Not just other parties in like situations, but parties in perhaps slightly different situations. And so you believe it or not, I'm sure you guys with the Socratic method understand how to deal with hypotheticals. You'd be surprised how often people say, that's not my case, and they sort of resist answering the hypothetical, as if you don't know that it's hypothetical. Obviously, the whole point of asking the hypothetical is we're testing the bounds of a certain principle. We're seeing if there is a limiting principle that makes sense, or if we can sort of push you off a cliff, if you will, and sort of use the hypothetical to show that we can't possibly take your position. Advocates should not resist hypotheticals. They should embrace them, lean into them.
We'll go to the audience after this, but any final questions?
Great, maybe we could just end this.
Can you hear my voice, by the way? I'm sorry, my voice, I feel like my voice is getting caught.
Or are you feeling?
I'm okay, I feel badly for you all. I thought I'd do more of this.
It's okay, my weak voice will always be the smallest in a room. Maybe we can just close with one piece of advice that you would give, not only to law students, but specifically to University of Chicago law students.
So hopefully you all went to law school for a reason, not out of default because you're not good at math or didn't want to go to med school. Hopefully there's some specific reason you chose to go to law school. It's a lot of money, it's a lot of stress. What I would say is try to figure out what it is you love about this. Why there's probably some general broad level of why you went to law school, but getting more specific. I've always been a big believer in the fact that if you love something, you're going to be better at it. And if you don't love something, you're just, at least me, maybe it's just a personality defect on my end, but if I'm not into something, I'm not going to be very good at it. I'm not going to work very hard. I'm going to become very lazy. But if I'm really passionate about something, I'm going to obsess about it, I'm going to hone my craft. And so the sooner you can figure out what it is that you love about this stuff. It doesn't have to be right now. It doesn't have to be during law school. I don't think I really figured it out certainly not until after I graduated. And that's okay. But try to figure out what it is that you love about the law and design a career around that. I would do that rather than doing what you're told. There are great career services people here, I'm sure, professors who want to recommend certain paths. But people who give advice, there's a natural bias, right? We all naturally advise you to do what we did because it worked for us, and so why not? But you need to figure out what's your path. And that might very well diverge from the standard fare advice that most people get and most people usually follow and should follow. So figure out what makes you, what attracts you to this vocation, and then design a career around that.
Well, thank you so much, Judge Hill. audience, so if you have a question, just raise your hand, we'll call on you. Yeah, George.
Thank you, Judge Ho. As an anecdote, prove that there is home field advantage. Alabama lost 2 games this year, both of them exclusively the fault of the refs at their stadium. Couldn't see else.
I think people blame the Super Bowl on refs too.
So my question is, what do you say or respond to people that say, well, the left, I'm just using the term of the word left, judges no longer playing referee, or they're playing referee with a side they want, that they are kind of going predisposed, and they know it, and they want the other party to win. How do you respond to the people for lack of better terms, or these days you're going like full Vermeulen and say they've had their fun, like now it's our turn to kind of let's play their own game with it. You know, like totally abandon originalism and go in predisposed to a party that we like and not be apologetic.
You're essentially asking me the CGC question, right? What do I think of common good constitutionalism?
Well, I think I know, yes. But I think I know, but like, how do you reason with them about the nature of judging? I guess it is CDC.
Yeah, it was a friendly answer. I wasn't giving a hostile answer. No, you're asking me sort of my views on common good constitutionalism. I'm happy to give. I actually gave a talk. The HLPP had a symposium on this topic. I was honored to speak there, and so I'll just sort of crib from what I said there. So I'm an originalist. Though I think I'm not a hyphenated American, I'm not a hyphenated originalist. And so I'm not a common good constitutionalist. Having said that, I have no desire and will not criticize common good constitutionalism for this reason. I get where they're coming from. And you sort of alluded to it in the premise of your question. I don't know if common good constitutionalists are upset with the left. I actually think, I wonder if they're more upset with, I hesitate to use these terms, but judges who claim the right can't do these. I think a lot of common good constitutionalists think that originalists haven't done good originalism. At least that's sort of my spin with that. At a minimum, this is how I sort of can try to form an alliance with common good constitutionalists. Like I said, I'm an originalist, so if they want me to go full authority, I'm not going to go there. But I can appreciate that. I think a number of Vermeulen's criticisms are well taken. One is essentially what I describe as the fair weather originalism criticism, right? That too often originalists have failed to live up to their words, in my view, due to cultural pressures. Vermeule also has a second criticism that I share, which is that there also, he has a lot of language in his book about originalists being conservative rather than being originalists, or being pro-corporation rather than being originalists. As I've said, in our chambers, we say text, not tribe. I've written about how the fact that, look, if a corporation has broken the law, then my job is to rule against the corporation. It's not to rule for the corporation because there's some sort of pre-existing prior there. The way I think of it, corporations aren't people, but like people, they can do good things, they can do bad things. And because corporations are essentially associations of people with leveraging that energy, when they do good, they do a lot of good. And when they do bad, they can do a lot of bad. I am no more going to put a thumb on the scales for a corporation or for a governmental entity than for any citizen. We're supposed to just go down the line. And I think, frankly, Vermeule is right that there are judges across the political spectrum who, all of us, I think, should be redoubling our efforts to A, resist pressure, and B, resist our personal viewpoints affecting and infecting the decision-making process. So I think the criticisms that common good constitutionalists like Adrian have are actually very well taken.
Yeah, Ben.
What do you think the future of originalism looks like? And I know that there are a lot of originalists who daydream about like overthrowing the Warren Court and all of the sort of rulings that followed from that. What is your take on those sorts of, I don't know, daydreams?
Daydreams? So, here's where I get to sort of retreat into the fact that I'm just a lowly little lower court, circuit court judge, right? And so the way I think of my role being an originalist is what I have sort of colloquially termed originalism maximization. And what that means to me is I sworn oath to uphold the Constitution, and so I try to follow the text and original understanding of whatever legal text is before me, whether it's constitutional revision, statute, what have you. I try to follow that to the maximum extent permitted, consistent with a faithful reading of Supreme Court precedent. Okay. The real nub of your question, of course, is if you're on the Supreme Court and you can essentially do whatever you want with Supreme Court precedent, what is your role of reconciling originalism with precedent? I think that's a fascinating, wonderful debate. My main take is you see Justice Thomas articulating his theory, I think most notably in Gamble, where essentially, I'll just sort of paraphrase, if he believes that a precedent is demonstrably erroneous, that is demonstrably not consistent with the text and original understanding of the Constitution, once you've met that standard, if you've met that standard, then he'll go with the Constitution and not the precedent. 2 points on that. One is, note that that is a standard, right? Just because there's sort of plausible disagreement, that would not be enough under that framework. It has to be demonstrable erroneous. But the second, and probably more important point I want to make is, if that is not the right view of the proper role between precedent and originalism, then I at least want to hear sort of what is the principled counterargument. I'm not sure I've heard it. What I instead hear are sort of varying degrees, varying theories of stare decisis that sound good as articulated in one case, but are inconsistently applied. If you want to overturn Roe and Dobbs under one particular theory, go for it. If you want to overturn Baker versus Nelson in Obergefell, go for it. But you have to explain to me what is your core theory. It cannot be, here's one thing I will say for sure is, it cannot be I will follow precedent when I like the precedent. That is utterly devoid of principle. There has to be, if you're going to have a theory other than the Justice Thomas view, I just want to hear what the argument is. I'm not sure I've heard it. If somebody wants to direct me to an opinion or something that I've not seen from one of the justices, I would be grateful because to me, going back to our earlier discussion about the importance of debates, I think Justice Thomas makes a very powerful, compelling point. Before any of us settle on one particular viewpoint, we should hear the competing theories. The problem is I'm not really hearing competing theories. What I'm hearing are opportunistic, situational arguments. Fair enough?
Joel?
Yeah, so after the 2020 election, you saw a lot of advocates have their law licenses pursued for like some fairly egregious, but others like pretty reasonable advocacy for their client. We've seen Professor Amy Wax at UPenn be hounded for her academic dissenting views. Is there any reason that those who disagree, who are like the broad majority, shouldn't continue to do so if they think that their moral views are incredibly important? And is there an appeal of the principle of free speech that one could make to them as to why they ought not to continue to hound their enemies?
So I want to make sure I understand your question. Is there any reason why?
Like UPenn shouldn't continue to silence dissenting voices that they view as morally wrong in the name of abandoning academic freedom, but in favor of inclusivity.
I guess let me take a shot at it, and you can tell me if I've not answered your question. I go back to what I said before about freedom of speech and the importance of having an open discussion. Second, this notion, I'll just go focus, you mentioned earlier about disbarring people based on legal positions. I think the main thing we want to make sure of is, are we applying neutral principles? If the notion, for those of you who are looking, you're going to see a lot of frivolous arguments being made in courts. You're going to see frivolous arguments that lose. You're going to see frivolous arguments that win, to be honest, or at least in my opinion. There are frivolous, but yet they commit some of my colleagues. I think there is a space, obviously, for disbarring people for corrupt behavior, for unethical behavior, et cetera, et cetera. When we get into the space of we're disbarring you because of the quality of your argument or the merit of your argument, I'm not saying never. I'm saying I would be very careful to make sure it's a neutral viewpoint, a neutral principle that you're applying. Because my concern, of course, given my other marks, is the disbarment that's happening based on a neutral principle, or is it based on, I don't like that viewpoint, so I will use this as another tool to advance my cause. So the core of my talk in Kentucky about the Yale Law School situation was called agreeing to disagree. And so the notion is, we used to be a country where we could get along with people. We would disagree in the political space. We would fight like hell to get our political viewpoints known, but then we would understand we would work together on everything else. We would interact with one another. We would be neighbors with one another. We would engage in commerce with one another. We would not use every tool available to us to try to destroy the other person. And what I fear is that we're starting to see more and more of that, where, we have a political disagreement, so not only am I not going to talk to you, not only am I not going to engage with you, I'm going to try to get you fired. I'm going to try to get you disbarred. I'm going to try to get you eliminated and expelled from the community. That's what I think really spells the end of, I don't mean to be hard to life, but the end of our country as we know it. Because essentially, as I said earlier, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists had this robust debate. The Federalists won. But if we go down this path, I think we're going to actually start to prove the Anti-Federalists right.
So we have time for 3 more, so let's go. Courtney?
Thank you for letting me speak. I was just curious if you had top mistakes you would say you see advocates making, and specifically how you would recommend balancing between advocating for your client but also trying to be reasonable in oral argument and kind of creating compromise where it's available.
Top mistakes. Sure. Great question. Frankly, this is going to sound kind of trite, but just not being prepared. Let me be more precise, though, to just be a little more helpful and concrete. You need to know where your weaknesses are and what concessions are safe for you to make. You'd be surprised how often I think the lawyer's thinking on their feet. Oh, should I concede this? Oh, sure, why not? No, your concessions need to be worked out in advance intellectually, if nothing else. But frankly, as a practical matter, talk to your clients. Your client might, if your client is an institution, company, government, whatever, it's not just one case. They're worried about other cases. They need to know what lines of concession are appropriate for them or not. And that might require a very robust internal debate. So going in knowing what you can concede safely and what you absolutely cannot concede. By the way, those are 2 mistakes. One is conceding where you shouldn't, but another is not conceding where you should. I do think, going back to our discussion about seeming neutral, seeming intellectual, almost, if a judge thinks of you as a law clerk, as an advocate, I think you've done a good job, because that's the vibe you want. Conceding effectively is a good way to get that vibe, because you sound reasonable. Is your position crazy? Would it lead to this result? No, Your Honor. You want a comforting answer, right? It doesn't lead to that, and here's why. So the art of the safe concession, I think, is, you asked for 3 mistakes. Not listening. You'd be surprised how often people, they're stuck to their scripts. They think that they're there to give a speech. The way I think of it is, the briefs are for the lawyers. The oral argument is for the judges. So yes, as an advocate, you should be prepared to give a speech if you should so happen to have a cold bench. But the moment you realize this is a hot bench, they're engaged, there's going to be a lot of questions, you should celebrate. That's great, they're engaged. If they're engaged, that means you have a shot to win. And you want to know where the questions are because you want to know what's bothering them. If you have a judge who's already with you, great. If you have a judge who's not with you, you actually, this might sound backwards, you want them to talk. If a judge is opposed to you and says nothing, then how are you supposed to engage with them? How are you supposed to know what bothers them? Until you know what bothers them, you can't convince them that they're wrong or convince them that they should change their mind. But you have to listen. And sort of codicil of that is not every question is hostile. I think there are some advocates who sort of, if a judge talks, they're immediately the enemy, and your goal is to fight them. I mean, putting aside the fact that obviously you're supposed to get the judge's votes, so you shouldn't fight every judge. Not every question is hostile. The judge could genuinely be trying to figure out, how do I write? If I'm going to write the opinion your way, how do I write it? Or it could be the judge is with you, but the judge knows one of their colleagues is not, and so it's a friendly question to try to help you with that other colleague. Don't assume that every question is hostile, and yet you'd be surprised how many advocates do. Even when it's obvious, like the whole courtroom knows it's friendly, but the advocate's the only one who knows. I mean, this has literally happened. I think I actually said recently, it's a friendly question, and the whole courtroom laughed because we all knew it was a friendly question. It's just that guy didn't know it. So listen.
Yeah, Ted.
Thanks for your time, Judge. So following up on your questions, your comments about quirking sort of the median level of public advocacy we've seen, I can see sort of the liberal or left budgets that each sort of bar is kind of a problem where many people after quirking will go into private practice for significant amounts of time, to the point that someone like Jack Phillips having very robust presentation from what cases initially filed, that seems to be far away the exception of the rule. And for your comments about Georgetown, clearly have an idea about the floor we should be pursuing with advocates. But I wonder if you had any advice for us about how to sort of integrate a culture of seeing the law as sort of a vocation or something where we should be pursuing it more so in public interest, to the point that we would be able to staff up the sort of robust defenses of constitutional rights and sort of values we want to pursue beyond doing it sort of on front and detour in the course of the case brief. Not that those things aren't important, but how do we sort of reorient to see that as sort of more core legal work as opposed to something incidental or something we do it more step by step?
So I'm sorry if I didn't understand the question. Is the idea, because you mentioned, you used Jack Phillips as an example, sort of how do you make sure that you're lawyering for all judges as opposed to a certain kind of judge? Is that what you're asking? Or?
More so, there seems to be a symmetry where there might be a shop set like the ACW where there is very low staffing and very good funding for public interest or impact cases sort of on one side of the line, but then there might be much smaller shops holding the other side of that line. So we have some recommendations culturally, whether it's professional outlook, vocational outlook, of how to be more deliberate in seeking out opportunities to do that kind of work once one's had sort of training that would put you, say, past that median point of advocacy.
Okay. Well, then let me take a shot this way now. If I've not answered your question, please follow up. Sorry, because I want to make sure I've answered your question. You're saying, you're asking a sort of career development question, like if you go to a law firm for a while, then you want to switch. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be obtuse. I just want to make sure I understand.
Sort of culturally, how can we, if it's keeping the children more honest, if it's really structure career, how do we ensure that step is always a viable possibility and that's something we're able to take when the opportunity comes?
So I'll take a stab at it. When I was in law firm practice, I made a genuine effort to recruit and to mentor people who clerked for different kinds of judges and brought different kinds of viewpoints. This was not because I'm a good guy and I'm an altruist. It was selfish because I have to represent my clients before any number of different kinds of judges. I practiced most frequently before the Fifth Circuit, although I did quite a bit of work elsewhere. And we have, back then and as now, a wide variety of different viewpoints. If I have associates and mooters who all reflect one viewpoint, I am not doing a service to my clients. I need to have people who have clerked. I have people in my chambers, my office, who clerked for everywhere from Edith Jones to Anne Williams. And it was wonderful, because that meant that in any given moot court, I would hear every possible question I would get, from a Steve Higginson or a Greg Costa to a Edith Jones or an Annie Older. I would get it all. That's the only possible way that you can prepare these cases. Is that sort of where we're going?
Yes.
Okay. And for what it's worth, my impression is that all of the prominent public interest groups across the spectrum do the same. I'd be shocked if they didn't, whether it's the ACLU or ADF or anybody else. Just to give one example, particularly the Supreme Court, if you're arguing a case before the Supreme Court, there are all these shops that will provide you moot courts for a variety of reasons. Georgetown does it, Heritage Foundation does it, a lot of groups do it. And the good ones make sure that they are comprised of people from every walk of life, because, just for what it's worth, I'm not aware of a court that is monolithic. The Supreme Court is definitely not monolithic. Our court is certainly not monolithic. If there's a court out there that is monolithic, I just haven't come across it. And so, no matter where you are, you have to be ready to answer questions from every possible perspective. And I'd just be surprised if any of those groups didn't appreciate that.
Well, guys, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Thank you.